Washington declared, without diplomatic ambiguity and without room for alternative interpretation, that the United States would take Iran's enriched uranium and that it needed no agreement to do so. The statement didn't come from a Pentagon communique or a classified memo leaked to the press. It came directly from the president's mouth, on camera, delivered like an announcement of a decision already made. And in that moment, what had been a tense but still formally open diplomatic negotiation transformed into something else entirely. A public ultimatum with implications reaching far beyond Iran's nuclear program. The number that defines what was at stake is this. According to estimates from the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran had accumulated a stockpile of enriched uranium exceeding 6,000 kilograms, enough, according to analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security, to produce fissile material for multiple nuclear warheads if enrichment were pushed from the 60% already achieved to the 90% required for military use. 6,000 kilograms. To put that mass in perspective, all the highly enriched uranium South Africa possessed when it voluntarily dismantled its nuclear program in the 1990s, the only case in history of a country that built nuclear weapons and then destroyed them, totaled just over 500 kilograms. Iran had accumulated more than 10 times that volume, and Washington had just announced in a national address that it intended to take it. Tehran's reaction was immediate and operated on two simultaneous registers. The first was rhetorical. The spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry classified the statement as a verbal act of war and declared that any attempt to seize Iranian nuclear material would be treated as direct military aggression with a proportional response. The second register was operational, and this was what concerned Western intelligence analysts far more intensely than the speeches coming out of Tehran. In the hours following the American declaration, commercial satellite imagery captured by companies such as Planet Labs began showing unusual activity at the Fordow nuclear facility, the enrichment complex built inside a mountain in Qom province, approximately 160 kilometers south of Tehran, deep enough underground to withstand most conventional strikes available in Western arsenals. And here was the paradox that planners had not calculated, or that, if they had not resolved. The threat to seize Iranian uranium without an agreement did not weaken Tehran's nuclear position. It accelerated it. Every public statement from Washington that eliminated diplomacy as a viable path pushed Iranian leadership toward the most dangerous logical conclusion possible. If the Americans are going to try to take our uranium regardless, the only real protection is to convert it into something that cannot be taken, a functional warhead. The equation had changed. Consider carefully what that paradox meant in practice. For years, the central argument of international diplomacy toward Iran had been that the cost of developing a nuclear weapon would outweigh the benefit. Crushing sanctions, economic isolation, the risk of preemptive military strike. But Washington's declaration inverted that logic with brutal efficiency. If the uranium would be confiscated regardless, the cost of not producing the weapon became, from the perspective of the strategists within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the parallel military force that controls Iran's nuclear program, potentially greater than the cost of producing it. The diplomatic deterrence built over 2 decades of negotiations, sanctions, and inspections was being dismantled by a sound bite delivered on camera. But the true impact of this declaration extended far beyond the nuclear calculus between Washington and Tehran. The economic dimension was devastating and immediate. In the 48 hours following the announcement, the price of Brent crude surged more than 7%, a move that, according to Goldman Sachs analysts, reflected the risk premium the market was assigning to the possibility of military confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, the maritime corridor just 21 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, through which approximately 20% of all oil traded on the planet passes. 20% of global oil through a choke point narrower than the distance between the banks of many European rivers. And Iran controls the northern shore of that choke point. In a moment, you will understand why that specific geographical detail changed the entire nature of the American threat, and why it transformed an unlikely ally into the greatest silent beneficiary of the entire crisis. The Iranian regime was not, as portions of Western media coverage suggested, an irrational actor reacting on impulse. It was a regime under extreme pressure, operating with the cold logic of survival. American sanctions had already cut Iran's official oil exports from approximately 2,500,000 barrels per day at the pre-sanctions peak to somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day through monitored channels, a drop of more than 80% in the state's primary source of revenue. The Iranian rial had lost more than 90% of its value against the dollar over the previous decade. Official inflation hovered above 40% annually. And now, on top of all of that, the President of the United States was publicly declaring his intention to confiscate the strategic asset Tehran considered its last bargaining chip. In the shadow of this monumental strategic miscalculation, one actor was watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the actor the headlines were not mentioning with the frequency that the data warranted: China. Beijing was, by a considerable margin, the largest buyer of Iranian oil, absorbing, according to maritime tracking estimates from Kepler and Vortexa, between 80 and 90% of all Iranian crude exports. Much of it transported by a ghost fleet of tankers that switched off their transponders when crossing the Strait of Malacca. Every rhetorical escalation between Washington and Tehran strengthened Beijing's negotiating position in two simultaneous ways. First, it deepened Iran's isolation, allowing China to negotiate even steeper discounts on the oil, estimated by Argus media analysts at up to 30% below the Brent price. Second, every American threat of military confrontation in the Persian Gulf raised global oil prices for every buyer dependent on non-Iranian suppliers, while China continued paying clearance sale prices. The paradox had closed on itself. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic most precisely is not the one the listener might expect. It is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where two superpowers reached the edge of nuclear confrontation and stepped back. It is the Suez Crisis of 1956, when France and the United Kingdom attempted to take the Suez Canal from Nasser's Egypt by force, convinced that military superiority guaranteed the political outcome. The military operation worked. The paratroopers seized the canal, and within less than a week, the combined economic and diplomatic pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union forced a humiliating withdrawal that marked the definitive end of the European imperial era. The parallel is surgical on 2 points. First, the assumption that raw military force resolves complex nuclear and energy equations, an assumption Suez permanently disproved. Second, the fact that the operation primarily benefited a third actor that had not fired a single shot. In 1956, that actor was the United States. In 2026, that actor was China. And here was what that layer revealed about the true nature of the crisis. There was a man in Tehran whose role illustrated with surgical precision the internal logic of a regime under pressure. Brigadier General Esmail Khani, commander of the Quds Force, the external operations arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, responsible for coordination with Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and the Houthis in Yemen, was a 4-decade veteran of asymmetric conflicts, and a man who, according to profiles published by the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, rarely spoke in public and never granted interviews to the Western press. This general was not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He was the operational coordinate of what the Iranian regime did when it felt cornered. Activate regional proxies to raise the cost of any American military action to a level that would become politically unsustainable in Washington. And that was exactly what intelligence data was beginning to indicate. According to U.S. Central Command reports cited by the Wall Street Journal, unusual logistical movements had been detected in at least 3 countries where the Quds Force maintained an operational presence: Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The Houthis, who had already demonstrated the capacity to strike commercial vessels in the Red Sea with anti-ship missiles and drones during the crises of 2023 and 2024, represented the most immediate and most difficult to neutralize instrument of asymmetric retaliation. A single anti-ship missile, with an estimated cost of between $50,000 and $100,000, was capable of forcing commercial vessels to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding between 10 and 14 days of transit and costs, estimated by Drury shipping consultants at up to $1 million per voyage for each large container vessel. The weapon had turned. But there was a layer we had not yet touched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. The impact was not limited to Iran, the United States, or even China. Russia, already strangled by Western sanctions and dependent on oil and gas revenues to finance its war in Ukraine, watched the escalation in the Persian Gulf with an ambiguous calculus. On one hand, rising oil prices elevated the value of every Russian barrel sold to India and China, even accounting for the discounts of up to $25 per barrel Moscow was forced to offer. On the other hand, any military confrontation resulting in a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz would create a global energy crisis severe enough to push Europe into accelerating its transition to alternative sources with an urgency that would make current sanctions permanent and irreversible. This is not merely a question of territory on a map. It is a question of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. Step back and look at the complete picture. An American president had publicly declared his intention to seize nuclear material from a sovereign state with no basis in any bilateral agreement, no United Nations Security Council mandate, and no identifiable legal mechanism under international law. The declaration did not create a path to Iran's denuclearization. It created the most powerful incentive imaginable for Iran to cross the nuclear threshold before any seizure operation could be executed. Every additional day was another day of pressure on the countries that most needed that resource, and that would impose on Washington a pressure that the White House, sooner or later, could not ignore. And here was what that specific geographical detail of the Strait of Hormuz changed. Iran did not need to win a conventional war against the United States, a scenario in which it would be crushed within weeks. It only needed to demonstrate credibly that military conflict in the Gulf would make transit through the strait risky enough to push oil prices past $200 per barrel, triggering a global recession. And that demonstration did not require intercontinental ballistic missiles or nuclear warheads. It required naval mines at $15,000 a unit, kamikaze drones at $30,000, and Revolutionary Guard fast boats carrying short-range anti-ship missiles operating less than 40 kilometers from the Iranian coast. The era of cheap, feared attacks had not ended. It had found its perfect theater. What Washington's declaration had produced, therefore, was not a position of strength. It was the involuntary architecture of a crisis in which every actor, except one, lost. The United States lost diplomatic credibility and elevated the risk of a conflict it could not win without catastrophic global energy costs. Iran lost negotiating space and was pushed toward the nuclear threshold under existential pressure. Europe lost energy price stability at a moment when it was already financing Ukrainian resistance. Russia lost predictability in the market sustaining its war. And China was buying Iranian oil at record discounts, watching its strategic rivals exhaust each other and waiting. The greatest paradox of the entire crisis lay precisely here. The weapon Washington had launched to neutralize the Iranian nuclear threat was, at that moment, strengthening the one actor none of the parties in conflict wanted to strengthen. The question that no analyst in Washington, Tehran, or Beijing was answering with sufficient clarity was whether the White House understood that every rhetorical escalation without a viable operational plan shortened Iran's timeline to a warhead and widened China's strategic window, and whether anyone in any office still held the authority to reverse that trajectory before the threshold was crossed. If this analysis has redefined the way you see the nuclear chessboard of the Middle East, share this video with those who still believe this crisis resolves itself with a sentence delivered on camera, because Fordow's clock has not stopped, and every centrifuge kept spinning.